Welcome to episode 51 of the Filmumentaries podcast. Thanks for joining me again. It's Jamie Benning here, talking to you from my little place in southeast London. That's England, in the United Kingdom, Britain. It's complicated actually, isn't it? But yes, here I am in England. Thanks for joining me again, or for the first time perhaps. Thanks also to the now 103 of you that support the podcast on Patreon. Yes, I reached my May target of getting 100 patrons, and now it's 103, so thanks very much. If you'd like to do the same, please check out patreon.com/Jamie Benning, that's JamieBenning, and for as little as $12 a year, or whatever currency you have in your country, you could help me in the production of 24 episodes of this podcast. If you can't help in that way, please do share, leave a comment or review, and let your film-loving, behind-the-scenes loving friends know about this podcast's existence. It's totally independent. It's just me, my mic, my laptop, and a guest. So your help is gratefully received. And as my friend Paddy, with whom I'm currently making a documentary, I know, more on that soon, keeps reminding me, I should also occasionally mention my feature-length filmumentaries, where the word came from. So they're film documentaries, filmumentaries. Not a great word, but do you know what? If you try and search for it on Google, there's no other word like it, so it's at the top of every search. But I made filmumentaries on Star Wars, The Empire Strikes Back, Return of the Jedi, Raiders of the Lost Ark, and Jaws, and they're still available for you to view on Vimeo. The best way to find them, because Vimeo's search is unusually rubbish, is to go to filmumentaries.com. That's filmumentaries.com. and click on the videos link. You'll find a number of my other video projects there that I did with Paddy, actually, including interviews with Yoda puppeteer Dave Barkley, Star Wars and indie producer Robert Watts, and long-time Ridley Scott collaborator and producer and writer as well. He wrote Finch, that film you might have seen on Apple TV. That's Ivor Powell. So yeah, do check out those videos and let me know what you think. Okay, today I have an amazing guest, an exclusive of sorts really, because he hasn't done that many interviews that I could find over the years. Namely, ILM matte painter and Weta art director, Michael Pangrazio. Now, if you recognise that name, you'll know that Michael is responsible for some incredible works of art from Raiders, Empire, Jedi, Dragon Slayer, Willow. It's another long list, have a look on IMDb. He also co-founded Matte World, along with previous Filmumentaries podcast guest, Craig Barron. That's episode 46, I think, if you want to have a listen. Michael is now based in Australia, after working for a number of years with Peter Jackson's Weta, 15 years, I think. And we spoke over Zoom in April 2022. So here's my conversation with matte painter and art director, Michael Pangrazio, and I'll be back at the end for a bit more jabbering on. Michael, when did you first become aware of matte painting and its role in filmmaking?
I was about 19 working in an art store in Pasadena, California. And a man came in, ended up being kind of a curious man the more he spoke to me. And he said, "Is there anybody here that could teach airbrush?" And I said, "Well, I could, because I've been doing airbrush self-taught for probably 4 or 5 years." So he gave me his number and we arranged time for me to come to his house because his wife was the one who wanted the lessons. So I ended up one of these nights going to his house. He was very kind to me and he offered dinner and I met his wife. And then he proceeded to talk about flying saucers to me because he was a flying saucer fanatic. And I was intrigued and slightly distressed at the same time. You know how you can have two reactions simultaneously. I was a little worried about him being a stranger and what he was saying was a little kooky and over the top. But he did have, he gave me an invitation to go up to his attic, seriously, okay? Which made me still doubly a little bit, concerned. But he ended up having what was a original matte painting by Albert Whitlock. And I don't know why he stored it in his attic and why he wouldn't have it more on display in his house, but that's where it was. So with a bit of trepidation, I went up the stairs and I got a chance to see my first matte painting. I didn't even know what matte paintings were. And I saw that it was a castle. It's beautifully painted. And there was blacked area. You know, it was like, that's where the matte is. That's where the live action would be inserted. And he explained that to me. And he said he had a little special effects company in Hollywood. And it was the old Gotham Studios in Hollywood, where they used to film the Little Rascals in, I guess, about 1908. It was a very old studio. And I went down there. He had a little bay and he had a machine, and it was him and me. And I did my first matte painting about 10 days after that because he got a small job. He had small jobs. He had a regular job too. So this was not a successful company. This was kind of a front projection company, they used to call it. It was a machine that would do front projection. It was used in 2001 Space Odyssey for those ape sequences, you know, where they had those beautiful landscapes that looked very like savanna of Africa in the background. Those were all front projected. The ability to use a 3M screen to project back the light at a high magnification so you wouldn't have to have the light source be so bright, and it wouldn't interfere with normal lighting, and you wouldn't see the projection on objects like someone. It would go past that because of hypersensitive screen in the background. Anyway, he was developing that technology. So that's the first time. And I worked on a movie called The Hazing, which was a fraternity, you know, probably not even a B film. It was probably a C or D film. And I did my first matte painting. It seemed to turn out okay. And I got introduced that way.
How long did it take you to kind of work out what you needed to do in a matte painting in terms of what the audience can read? Because, you know, you look at some of the matte paintings up close and there's I don't know, 200 stormtroopers, for instance, but really when you get up close, the detail isn't there on every single one. Did it take you some time to learn that part of the craft, like what you did need to do and what you didn't need to do?
Yeah, I think I naturally have a sloppy kind of approach to my work. So that made me naturally able to do that. I am kind of a lazy artist. I don't like to put more effort into something than it has to be. And, you know, there's not only the impressionist, and I'll explain why that kind of seems to work better. There's also like diminishing detail on the edges of the frame. So where's the center of focus? You know, whatever the shot is trying to say, you got to kind of establish that. It's usually center of frame or just slightly off. That's where the most detail has to be, because that's, and then also you have the benefit of these shots being 3 or 4 seconds. And by the time somebody takes in the whole image and their brain is processing it, we're on to the next shot. So that helps a lot. You could hide a lot in that, plus the edges, as I mentioned before. But the impressionist, I think there is a kind of a problem with stiffness. If someone paints something too technically, it looks graphically stiff. If the edges are too hard, now film will soften things because it's grain. It was silver nitrate basically, so it had a granular structure to the film as it got processed. But it which softens things. And digitally today, it's like going from that analog to the digital, where they started to leave behind film and started using digital cameras for, let's say, soap operas or something. You saw this change of harshness, how hard everything was, and how the lighting kind of bloomed. The midtones were kind of gone. Everything, there was a much smaller spectrum of bandwidth there to the lighting. Anyway, so I think for those reasons, I also had a mentor when I went to ILM, Alan Maley, who was an old-time contemporary of Peter Ellenshaw. And they had done a lot of work for Disney, like Mary Poppins and things like that, especially Ellenshaw. But Alan Maley was an old-time English man, and he taught me all these things. I was there as an apprentice at ILM when I first started working there.
How did that come about? Was that Joe Johnson that first got in touch with you to get you to join ILM?
Yeah, it was kind of a bridge of these two poles. One was the Intravision company that I mentioned before, this little garage operation. And he had arranged Battlestar Galactica was in pre-production at Universal Studios. And we were probably only about 5 miles from Universal, maybe even less. So we're pretty close, the little company I work with. So I was asked to go there by the owner of the little company. I don't know how he arranged for that to happen, because Glenn Larson at the time was the producer, and he was like the top producer in Hollywood for television. But Battlestar Galactica was kind of a rip-off, opportunistic pile-on to the genre from the success of Star Wars. So he grabbed Joe Johnson and Ralph McQuarrie. So I ended up going to that meeting, probably one of the least likely people to ever be called to go to a meeting that had that level of, I suppose, expertise and accomplishment, because I'd accomplished nothing other than working on The Hazing, which is a film probably nobody saw. But at that meeting at the end, I was very respectful. Of course, I'm wise enough to not open my mouth too much. So at the end of the meeting, I think it was both of them, actually, Ralph and Joe Johnson, came up to me and kind of started asking me like who I was and why I was at the meeting. So I had a sweater on, and I had put, I think, about 4 or 5 8x10 photographs of my artwork, and I stuffed them inside my sweater. So they asked me what I did, and I said, well, I have some of my work. And so I pulled up my sweater and I pulled out these images and handed them to them to look at. Probably the most unprofessional, bizarre sort of exchange that's probably ever been. Unrehearsed, innocent in a way, naive, I suppose. But that made me probably memorable to them. It wasn't the same old CV and the same old pitch, kind of thing. It was much more, naive. And I guess my work was good enough for them to look at it and say, well, that's got potential. So I gave Joe my number, and about 3 months later, he called me and said, we're looking for an apprentice to be a matte painter at ILM up in Marin County. And are you interested? And well, of course, because I had really very little going for me at that point. But I had worked on a lot of my own little paintings, because since that time I met Ralph at Universal, I became friends with Ralph. And Ralph lived in Los Angeles at the time. So I was able to go to his house upon invitation. I didn't abuse that. But I became a real fan of Ralph, and he was such a kind man. And he enabled me to be able to look over his shoulder and watch him paint. And he would then, influence me. I would do my own painting, come back the next time, which could have been a couple of weeks later, and show him my work, and he would critique it, honestly. But being a kind of gentleman, he did it with a lot of panache, and, he wasn't, I think he did it with a lot of class, let's put it that way, being critical. But I learned, and I got to know him really well. I think I knew him for probably 1.5 years, 2 years. And I go over to his house and have lunch and watch him paint. And so this is the time that I really was developing. And so I knew Ralph before I went up to ILM, because I had an interview. And I flew up there and met Joe and Nilo Rodis, who was another kind of art direction person in the art department. We all had lunch. I real quick, I'm going to kind of back up, because when I did arrive there, I had little paintings again, but I think I had the wherewithal to put them in probably a paper sack this time, maybe a shopping brown paper sack rather than my sweater. So I got asked to walk into the screening room and place my paintings on the floor against the wall, the screening room, the ILM screening room, which wasn't very big at the time. It was pretty small, actually. Maybe 50 people would fit in there, next to each other. So it's pretty small. And as I was walking out, George Lucas walks in, and Richard Edlin, who was the effects supervisor. And I didn't know who Richard was at the time, but I recognized George because I'd seen pictures of him. So I guess evidently what happened as I was leaving is that they came in, they analyzed the work, and I guess they liked it enough. And so I had a lunch with Joe and Nilo. And I don't know if I heard I got a job then, or if I returned home, and I think I returned home, and maybe a week later, I got offered the job to come up and be the apprentice.
Wow. Yeah, I interviewed Nilo as well. Actually, he's an interesting guy.
Yeah.
He's yeah. He agreed to do the interview, not over Zoom. He couldn't do it over Zoom, but he said, "I'll do it over the phone, and there's a cupboard I can sit in, so it's nice and quiet." So he sat in a cupboard on the telephone to me for like 2 hours. We
Do
chatted.
you know what the noise pollution was?
I think it was he's his little studio in. I think he's in Toronto these days. I think he said there's a lot of building work going on there or something. So he kindly sat
Oh,
inside
wow.
this its cupboard for me, and like, yeah, he was great. He's like a real life Yoda. He was just imparting all this sort of wisdom and
Yeah, I remember. I have fond memories of him. Very fond. I always liked him.
yeah, just a sweet guy. When you were brought into ILM, what was your first kind of task then? What was the first job they gave you to work on?
Well, they gave me a job to do some snow painting because I think they were evaluating, like first of all, testing me. And then based upon the result of that, they would then strategize how to approach shots and to see if it was credible to do them through painting. As opposed to like I was saying, from projection, they could take photographs. I think they went to Iceland where they shot a lot of, for Empire, they shot a lot of location work. And so they had 4x5s, maybe 8x10s. And they could have done front projection for a lot of this, like the Sykes and the backings and things like that. But so I got given a job of doing a little, I think it was like what was it? Electrical plant, energy producing architectural structure on Hoth. And I did that as a test shot. And there's a picture of it that I have somewhere. I saw it the other day.
Like the shield
Um,
generator thing, the
that's
circular
right.
kind of yeah, yeah.
Yeah.
Mm.
And I had a red deluxe hat on, deluxe being a processor of film. So if you ever see that painting, I could send it to you if you're interested.
Yeah, that'd
But
be cool. Yeah.
so I had that job, and then I got the job of working on the asteroid sequence. One doing a painting of a kind of asteroid surface, and the other one doing a lot of fine work on glass panes that would then be shot through to like smaller miniatures getting bigger to the background of bigger asteroid pieces that were on motion control sticks and things like that they
Hmm.
were tumbling, doing frame by frame, basically animation on them, using the servo motors and things. So I was doing a lot of toothbrush work, frankly, of making these dense clouds of asteroids in the deep distance, to go in back of all this stuff. So that's the first task I had.
Yeah, yeah. It's interesting that at what point it's decided we're going to use a matte painting here, but we're not going to use it here. I was interviewing Lorne Peterson a couple of weeks ago, and he was talking about that shot of him as a kind of rebel soldier as the X-wings all take off for the final battle in Star Wars, and it was shot in Guatemala. And I said to him, "Why wasn't that a matte painting?" And he wasn't sure actually. He seemed to think it was maybe that it was March 77. The film was due out in May. Maybe the optical department was like a logjam at that time, so they needed them to go shoot that. Were there ever any moments on those early films where you felt that should have been a matte painting instead of a miniature, or vice versa?
Oh, that's a really interesting question. I don't know if I've ever thought that thought before. Um,
There's one shot you actually did. I think it's in Return of the Jedi of the Millennium Falcon.
oh
Um,
yeah.
Out of the window. I think that Han Solo is looking at it for the last time, maybe before the battle. I
Mhm.
think that's a matte painting as opposed to a
Yeah.
miniature, which kind of seems odd because I think they had the full size Falcon there. Maybe it was just an afterthought. Oh, we need a shot there, and maybe matte painting was the best way to achieve that. I guess that's sometimes why matte painting is chosen because it is the best way to achieve that effect, and maybe the most economical.
I think you've got me stumped because you bring up such a good point. It makes so much logical sense what you're asking. I don't know why they would go to the expense and the extra time to do a matte painting where they could, we had at ILM Terry Costner, I think his name was. We had a photographic department, They could have easily taken the model, lit it.
Mm,
I could have lit it for them. That's one thing I love doing is lighting,
mm,
miniatures and things like that. I became, you know, I over time I became pretty experienced at lighting things, and I enjoyed that immensely. But it would have been very easy to light that and just photograph it and insert it in the film.
mm.
But I don't know why. It's a really good question. Why wouldn't they do that? So I think you've answered your own question, but in reverse.
Yeah,
Because
I
it's
think.
like, rather than more, it's like, why did they do some of these in the first place? Why did they choose to do them that way? I don't know.
While you were at ILM, you went from being, like a apprentice to being head of the department pretty quickly. How did that
Yeah.
come about?
Um, well, Alan was tasked with training Chris Evans and myself because when I walked into the department for the first time, I think Chris might have been there or just hired after me. I think I was the first one actually, and then soon after Chris was. I don't know. I mean, Alan has passed away, so I suppose I could be more direct about what the fact is behind that, which was I think it was very expensive. And they could see that I had made so much progress in such a short period of time. And I was cocky. When you're young, you're very cocky and you kind of don't know what you can't do. And you also, because that's the way of all mammals in a way, they experiment, right? We don't know our
Hmm.
limits. That's like immature mammals, we do that. But I think it was also because I was so much cheaper and I was enthusiastic and um, I didn't try to be political about it or petition for that job. But they called me in the office one day and they asked me, "Do you think you could do that?" And I said, "Well, sure," being cocky, in other words. So they gave me the job, and I just kind of did it. But it was I think after a year or something of being there. And I know Harrison Ellishaw was first supervisor uh, there before me. So he wasn't on um, some of the films later, and that's where I took over from there.
Mm, mm,
I was kind of an innovator. I had solved a lot of problems in this really. I'd done things in a very different way because again, I'm driven by this. Can we do something like really fast that makes it look better? Where I don't have to like paint every stroke of it. Can we use like plexiglass or miniatures or combinations of models and paintings? Can we do different things? So I was kind of an innovator and they saw that. Whereas I think Alan was so, you reach a point of like, these are the ways to do things, especially if you're teaching other people. Like there's a doctrinaire kind of quality that comes through after years of doing it a certain way. And I'd kind of like not really been exposed to those old methods so much, very minor in respect to them with Alan. So I thought out of the box a lot, and they saw that these things worked and they were quick, and yeah,
mm. Yeah, I bet, I'm thinking about mentors, and you mentioned Ralph, and you mentioned Alan and Harrison and all those people. I'm sure that them seeing somebody young and up and coming like yourself who's got this approach that you just talked about was probably good for them as well. I mean, Ralph comes, of course, from a technical background where he's drawing manuals, for the construction of aircraft parts and things like that, and aeronautical stuff. And I'm sure, it works both ways. You're learning from him and he's learning from you because,
oh yeah,
you've got different approaches. So I think that's the
yeah,
important thing about mentoring, isn't it? Pass on what you've learned, but still be kind of open to take in new stuff from maybe somebody who has a different approach to you.
yeah. Well, I think that's the way of if you're honest with each other and you get the egos put aside, that is the ultimate way to like make new discoveries of how to do things better. When you don't even own it, when you're young enough to just kind of like think out of the box and then mention it because you're not strategic about it. You're just like excited and your enthusiasm kind of promotes it and it blossoms if it works. I think that's the best way to be innovative. That's where I suppose being young is important to some extent.
Mm, yeah, I think your work, because of course has been very inspiring to many people, as has a lot of people's work on those early Star Wars and Indiana Jones films. In fact, I remember age 9 turning on the TV at my grandparents' house one weekend, and How to Film the Impossible, the BBC Horizon documentary was on, and there you are talking about the famous Raiders warehouse map painting, and my mind was genuinely blown. I thought, I mean, I knew those movies. I'd watched them in the cinema, and I think maybe VHS had kind of appeared by this point, but I hadn't really fully understood that those were paintings. I mean, that's the real aim of your job, I guess, isn't it? To make sure that people don't realize that it's a painting. But but what was it like to have that your work kind of highlighted in that way in a documentary?
Well, I think in hindsight, very exciting and very privileged. And I feel very grateful that I was able to be there at that time and place for some of these films that have turned out to be classic films.
Mm.
And I think Raiders as a whole, I think if you could define a film as classic, I first think of, Casablanca or something. And then I think of Raiders. I think it's in the same category. And it's so well done. I start watching it from time to time. I haven't gotten through the whole thing, in one sitting, but it's remarkably well done, I think. And it harkens back to all these almost cliche shots and dialogue, but there's some substance in all that narrative that kind of keeps you on the edge of your seat. It's very adventuresome. So I'm very privileged to look back on it. At the time, it's just a job for me. And the way I psychologically dealt with, I guess, life generally, which nobody's asking, but I'm going to just volunteer, is that I don't think of myself as indispensable. I think of myself as replaceable. And so I prepare myself at any time to be dismissed from what I have a privilege of being, practicing or being hired for. And I felt like that during the first several years of working at ILM, especially. I felt like, they're probably going to fire me any day, because I became very let me just say this. I was kind of rebellious in a lot of ways to the organizational structure, because corporations, they start off usually when they're new, being very open, a bit Wild West, a bit of, maybe constructive chaos. And then over time, middle management grows and it becomes very orderly. And yet that consequence is inefficiency. It's lack of new innovation. There's all kinds of problems with that. And as I got, further into the years at ILM, I felt like I was wanting to remain back in the past, where things were much freer in a way, because I believe in that creativity. I think that sparks creativity. So that's how I felt about, in hindsight, working on all these films. I was so privileged to work on like E.T. and Raiders and Temple of Doom, Poltergeist, maybe a little bit less, but some of these classic films, I look back on it and I think, wow, I was right there at the right time in the right place.
Yeah, that's pretty cool looking back, and they are regarded as classics now. They're the films that I grew up, and it's my generation's classics, I guess. But taking a painting like that government warehouse, the final shot of the movie, I was talking to Lorne Peterson about the Star Destroyer model coming overhead being the first shot in the movie, and how people had to buy into the movie straight away in Star Wars, and with yours being the last shot in the movie, it has to kind of tie up the loose ends, or kind of leave us wondering, and to have that privilege to have the last shot in a movie must be pretty amazing, particularly as the credits go over it as well. We're lingering on that shot for some time. How do you go about creating a shot like that? Do you start with pencil first? Do you go straight into painting? Are you straight on glass? What's the process?
Well, I'm too lazy to do a lot of preparatory work. So generally we would get a storyboard from either ILM itself, art department, like Nilo might have created that, a sketch, or we get it through the wider production from the outside, from maybe England, where they were doing a lot of Pinewood Studios work. And that warehouse, I don't know, I can't recall who created that, how we got it, but that was provided. So I had something to look at. Now, I think that shot is like maybe a minute or two. By the time it fades, I think it slowly fades to black mercifully, because matte paintings aren't made to be that long on the screen, because you start to look at it and it's like, well, whoa, that's all the flaws you start to see, So the preparatory work would be, I would have taken that, and as I remember, I always liked shooting like some photography, because it gave me the key fill ratios and all these little nuances of the way the light bounces on things. So I think I had a bunch of little boxes that were cut out at squares to represent the crates, and stacked them up in a row, per the storyboard, inspired by that. And then I got pools of light and lit it, because like a warehouse would have these, this grid of lighting that was symmetrical and, kind of predictable, throughout the building. I did that, took some shots, and then used those photographs as inspiration, because we had light boxes and I could look through a loop. In the old days, we had these 10 power loops, so we could see, we could look in like a monocle, basically, with the old fashioned monocle, it just magnify, the image of the slide. And I use that a lot to kind of inform me of all those nuances that my brain just could not come up with by itself through imagination. That's one thing that I at least know that I know my limitations. I know that my brain is incapable of coming up with the nuances that photography could, or observation of reality. It's so complicated. Now they've made a lot of progress today with that, with the digital world, with the software and all the code and everything. It's like they've kind of imitated the physics of light. I mean, they've really come a long ways. But back then we had to do things in a very crude way, and that's how I prepared for it. And that shot took me about 3 months to paint, as I recall. And then Alan kind of came in and finished some of the ceiling, showing me, oh, this is how you do it, And I think it, in hindsight, I guess it worked. I've had people tell me that they had a friend who was an architect, and he said he had no idea that wasn't a real building. But being an architect, I would think he would know that the load strength of those upright beams were probably wrong, right? Because this is a painting and I'm making this up, and this isn't really if it was a real building, it probably would collapse the way it was painted. But anyway, he was convinced. So I felt good about that. I feel good about a lot of the work that I did in the past. People seem to be very, I don't know, it influences your lives. I would love to talk about one quick thing. And we could insert it if you feel it's appropriate. My experience with social media, and all the years that since I've been doing this film work, I kind of hid from any notoriety. I wasn't interested. But now that I'm kind of retired, I wanted to get involved with social media to a certain extent, and like maybe collect some of the work of the past and put it on a site and just show people. But the reaction is so unexpected that I can really see that it touched a lot of people's lives, and they grew up with it. It's part of their memories of their childhood in a way, or teenage life. And so it's indelible in their mind, and it's thought of fondly, and it took them to another place that they hadn't thought of before. So I think it has done a lot of good, and I get that goodwill coming from people, and it's kind of amazing to me. And I kind of I kind of feel overwhelmed sometimes by it, because it's so kind and it's so complimentary. It's not mean, like a lot of people probably have experiences with social media that it's horrendous and mean. Mine has been, and maybe I shouldn't say anything, right? Because mean people will start to like show me the truth about how, what I've been avoiding. So I won't say anything more. You can cut that part out.
I don't know. I think it's something to do with the innocence of childhood and growing up and discovering these new worlds and discovering these, these new ways of creating things. Because as kids, we're all creators, aren't we? We're always, whether it's with mud or with pencils or whatever, we're always trying to do something, create something. And I think people have a real nostalgia about that kind of stuff, about that discovery and about that sort of creative childhood. So I can see why people are enthusiastic about it. I can see why people are connected to it still.
I think it's like books. I think it's the same thing, is that you kind of fill in with your brain. You're a participant in the narrative, in the process, and the visuals to a certain extent.
Mm-hmm.
Film is more probably explicit than reading a book. But even if you read a book, you're filling in what you think it looks like. At least I do. Maybe I think most people do.
Mm-hmm.
You're imagining, if it's describing a scene, you're imagining it in your mind. It might be fuzzy, but it's still like there's something hanging there that wasn't there before, and it's changing and morphing as you're reading. And to me, that is interaction. You're participating in the process, and that's almost like you're part of that creative process, the author of that. I'm sure if they were insightful enough, would predict the fact that people can be participants and finish the work that they started as a seed that was planted, and then the people's imagination fills in the rest. And I think that's kind of a beautiful, extension, a magnification of how important work is like that.
Well, I want to get on to talking about, some more of your work with Matt Weld and Weta and so on, but I also want to talk about, now you mentioned social media. I saw that you revisited Jabba's palace, as it were, and recreated a painting of the exterior of Jabba's palace. Some 20 years since you last picked up a brush and painted in that way. What was that experience like? And did it kind of bring back memories of that time?
It did. It brought back memories of how competent I used to be. And that I realize now how out of practice I am. And I look at the work, and I guess it was my attitude. It was like, I think of a little kitten. A kitten doesn't really know its limitations, and it gets in trouble because of it. I think it was that in my energy level. Not that I don't have a pretty good energy level today, but I was practicing every day. 5 days a week, let's put it that way, to be more accurate. And I got really good at that. And then if you haven't done it for 20 years, it could be anything, probably. You're not going to be quite as good at it, and you're going to have to kind of relearn it. So I struggled with that. That painting probably took me, a tenth of the time when I did it originally back in the 70s or the 80s, I guess it was 82 or something like that. So it was, I found myself like struggling to make it look good, struggling to like, how did I do this? Trying to relearn how to do it. And I think if I did it every day, struggling for a while, it would give way, and I could get back and probably be flooded with all this, all these memories and all this muscle memory of how to do this stuff. But there's no need to. I don't need to anymore. Photoshop exists. I still create in Photoshop, and it's a lot easier. And it's quite remarkable what you can do in Photoshop. I kind of love the program. I think it's fantastic.
And it's a tool at the end of the day, isn't it? You're still applying the same understanding of composition and lighting and everything else. It's just a tool that helps you achieve that quicker, maybe.
It is. I think it's like, if you're Bach or somebody like that, and you're having to hand write your music, and today you could do it on a computer by just, maybe you can even do it on a keyboard, and it automatically spits out and prints out the music for you, I think it's just an advance that makes things more interactive and quicker and more efficient. And that enables you to experiment more, because you have more time. You can, for the same amount of time, you've got a lot more options, iterations that you could produce. So I think it's really helpful. I think that's why the work has gotten, in special effects generally, it's gone, when I look back on the stuff with nostalgia, and a lot of people do too. To be frank with you, the work isn't nearly as good as it is today and convincing. You go back to the 80s and you look at the optical printer compared to what we have today. The camera moves, the realism of it, even the moving into, and I wish I knew the phrase for it, maybe you can help me with it, where you imitate a human being and you're able to have a purely digitized human being speaking to you. That has gotten much better. I've seen that arc because I was at Weta for many years, and they specialized in that. That was a goal for them, in particular, to highly achieve, credibility with that. That's improved a lot to where now I think you could have somebody that isn't real talking to you, and maybe you wouldn't know it. I don't know if it's that good yet, but getting close.
It's getting there for sure, isn't it? Yeah, yeah. I was thinking actually, talking about a comparison to a digital map painting and say a physical map painting that you would have been involved in those early days. How did you go about ensuring that the lighting and the composition was kind of in keeping with the cinematography of the live action? Did you get to see dailies? Did you have a discussion with the DOP? How did that come about?
That's a really good question. Well, in kind of what we would call pre-production for visual effects, which is different than pre-production for a film. There's a difference between the visual effects are mostly post, in the film, because the film's all shot pretty
Yeah.
much. So in a way, if you want to apply the phrase pre-production for visual effects, we sometimes would have, I remember we had like a stylization discussion of what things should generally look like. And a DP was pretty indispensable, especially when I was at Weta. I remember the DP was more involved post-production in kind of guiding the visual effects and having some influence, which is kind of unusual to think about, but because their job is usually done, they've shot the film and they do whatever they do after that. But they were still lingering further into the whole process, into the visual effects. So I do remember, of course, looking at the shot before and after is very important, especially if they're the same world, the same universe, and it's a shot within that universe. You've got to study that universe, which is live action on each side or a set, and try to glean its essence and reproduce it in a way to where it's seamless. So that's very important, just as it's important in the original. I might be speaking of something too technical here, but the original latent image map painting process, where you are having to match live action to artwork. So the same rules apply to that too, to make sure that those two worlds mesh in a way that it's not just coming up to the line, so to speak, where they merge together, where they meet. It's also that they look as a singular image, they look like the same place as much as possible. So in that way, it's kind of macro or micro in, it broadens out to the whole sequence that you're involved in.
So you created, I believe, or involved in the creation of that stained glass window in Young Sherlock Holmes, which of course was one of the first CGI characters, I guess, on screen. Was there an awareness at that point that your expertise and your craft of many years was kind of due to become something of the past?
I don't think at that point we took it that serious, but there are people that always they see over the horizon. And these are the visionary people that can see the potential of something. I think George is that kind of person. I think he saw well beyond, the momentary limit of what things were as they are now. So I started working on, I think there was a B thing. What I mean by B is that there was a little digital produced, created B character. And that was before the stained glass. And I got a chance to kind of be slightly involved, not too much, but they were interested in people's eyes and how things looked, like asking somebody from your eye, what do you think? Analyzing the visual of it. So I went over there, and it was across the parking lot, basically. And that was the first digital department. And I remember working on that, and Dennis Mirren worked on the stained glass, and I think he was way more involved than I was. Chris Evans, I think, worked on it a little bit, but we probably just gave opinions at certain stages of what we thought. Did it look real? Did it, but strategically, I wouldn't have a clue of how to help anybody figure out anything in that area. At that time, I was, again, kind of a lazy artist who wanted just to do their work from more of an intuitive quality rather than intellectual quality. And that's where I think that's where my forte, I think the center of the core of how I work creatively is my intuition. And I'm not saying people that don't write code and aren't technical don't have it, because I think they do too. But I think it's a different part of the brain that is working when you're developing something purely technical, analytical, new, using numbers, to try to create something, mathematics and things. So yeah, I helped a little bit, but no, I didn't take it seriously. But did I think it would replace? No, not then. Was I paranoid about it years after that? Always. Even at Weta, there were moments where I declared the death of map painting, and yet it still seems to survive in some way, because I think the number crunching is too heavy for deep background. And so they can get away with the painting and insert it back there without having to actually process all that stuff. So I think that there's still an economic angle to it, but I haven't been there for about a year or two. So I don't know. Maybe they solved that problem.
Mm. What was the catalyst for the change from ILM to Macworld? Because you're co-founder, right, of Macworld with Craig Barron.
Well, it was what I referred to earlier, and I'm being very explicit here, but I guess there's no reason not to be, if I'm tactful, is I was very rebellious. And what I mean by that is not arbitrarily, but I was protecting, because I was head of the department, I was protecting the department from what I felt was inefficient interference with process. And I'm being vague about it on purpose, so I don't get personal about it. But that always was a threat to me, because I thought that we should be left alone to do our job. And they wanted to identify the process and stages and oversee everything. And I felt like at one point or another, and maybe I'm being too generous about my memory of it, but that we were known as, at certain times, the best department in the company, the map painting department. We would sometimes, I remember fondly, we would keep there was a showmanship thing to it. I would keep it completely secret. I wouldn't let anybody see it. I wouldn't let the middle management in the door. We'd lock the doors. We'd come up with the shot. We'd show the shot when I felt like it was impressive enough. And sometimes we got applause in the screening room from people that didn't even expect to see that. And there was a certain amount of showmanship to it, an artistry, I think, presentation, that gets killed by, like having too many people and too many hands in the kitchen, working. Just if you've got a chef that's successful and he's pumping out really good work and the customers love it, leave him alone. Why interfere? That's how I felt. So that was the catalyst that led Craig and I to talk about maybe we could start our own thing. And that's where the phrase, the name of the company was Macworld, because I always thought of, like, it was kind of a tongue-in-cheek name, because matte painting, right? Very few people know what an MATT was, other than a certain class of small percentage of people in the film industry. But world was universally used for things like carpet world and office world and whatever, waterbed world. And so I attached world to matte world on the end of it, just as a joke, at the beginning. And then that stuck, because you start getting, like, officializing your company, and you start, maybe you incorporate it, then you're stuck, at least for a while, then it becomes like, maybe I shouldn't have said that. Maybe it should have been taken more seriously. But that's what we picked for a name. We decided to leave. I think I think Craig left about the same time, and then we opened up. He had some contacts with HBO, and so he got kind of a job to help lure us and make a transition out of ILM and still make a little bit of money. I had a family at the time, a couple of kids, and you don't want to be irresponsible about it and just leave your job, because it was a good job, So he had a little project with HBO, and so that moved us out of there, basically, into our own company, because I thought for years, like, why couldn't we just do this ourselves? Which is probably, it doesn't take that much. There's a little bit of equipment, overhead and expense in development, with any kind of equipment. And we had moving cameras that would move into glass paintings and things like that and create motion. And that was all like early computer stuff. So it was probably really expensive. But, if you could do a certain class of shot, you could do a lot cheaper than ILM. So we could kind of undercut them in the marketplace. It's just having credibility, with big companies and things like that. That's what the struggle is, your little name. But I remember we got the job and we did it and they loved it. And it sort of blossomed from there and became successful I was there for 7 years with that company. And we did a lot of work. And then after I left, Craig still was there for several more years. And he did a lot of really great work with more films. And the credit list for that company, being kind of a tongue-in-cheek Matt World company, ended up being pretty impressive. It didn't rival maybe ILM's, but it was pretty close in some ways. Worked on some pretty important films. So,
yeah. Going back to what you were saying about how you would like the matte painting department to be kind of autonomous in a way. I mean, Craig spoke a bit about that, how there was a bit of resentment potentially about, from other departments, that you could go from concept through right to straight into the movie, because you had your own, you could do the optical printing within the department to a certain extent. Like I think even at one point Craig dressed as Darth Vader to walk down the ramp of the shuttle for Return of the Jedi. And maybe potentially there was some resentment from other people that, you didn't have to go through that process where everybody's critiquing your work, stage by stage. So I can see why you kind of endeavored to escape that when it kind of turned into that situation.
Yeah, I think it was also because the latent image process too is so intricate and so kind of mysterious to people. Where we'd film and black out on location, certain part of the film, and run off processed film, the cut with maybe 100 feet on each side, tail and head of unexposed film, and then take that and start to project it, a small exposed, clip of maybe a few frames. And we start to paint from it, and then we composite it with the original negative. Now that original negative is irreplaceable. Because once you've shot on location, you're like I guess you're a B camera crew or something like that. Or maybe you're an A camera crew, which is even more, there's more jeopardy to that, losing that. So we would end up having to be very cautious. And Craig was very good at this. Craig was very meticulous, and you have to be. So we've never had a failure with that. So I think the success of it was like, don't you recognize, here's a quandary, and I'll just try to be very brief about it. It was like, management would look at it and say, well, we need to check what you're doing. And why? And they would say, well, because we just have to know what's going on. And I would say, well, why do you have to know what's going on? If we end up being successful and we have a track record of several years of successes, and they said, well, we just have to have people know for the assurance of all these, maybe upper echelon people. And I'd say, well, okay, fine. You trust the person who's checking up on me, but what if they don't know what they're doing? Then you have to have a person that checks up on the person checking up on me. And what if that second person checking up doesn't know what they're doing? Then you have to have a third person, so on and so forth, right? And you see the exponential growth of middle management. And it becomes this impediment.
Yeah. That's what was your exiting from Matt World kind of driven by disillusionment with the industry? Did you feel like you needed a break from it, or
I always did?
Yeah.
The moment I stepped in, I think when I first arrived at ILM in Marin County, it was a new world. It was a kind of exciting. I was a Star Wars fan because of the original movie. I remember seeing it at Grauman's Chinese Theater in Hollywood. And so it was probably like presented almost as good as you could see it at the time. And I had a motorcycle. I was putting around on a Honda 350 at the time. And I remember, like after I got out of the movie, I got on my bike to go home, and I felt like an X-wing or something. That film influenced me in such a profound way after I had walked out of the theater, that I felt like I was still in the movie to a certain extent by just the motion of, that it presented to me, the feeling of moving through space, so to speak, no pun intended. So I really was impressed with that movie. I was a fan, so it was very exciting to go there and be hired to work on the sequel. But after that, the initial blush of enthusiasm and the routine set in, which is long hours, kind of isolated job. I remember walking out at night at 8 o'clock at night, being hungry. The neon lights were on inside the building, and I was headed toward the parking lot. And the sense of kind of isolation of the job and kind of the loneliness of it in a way. You work with people all day, but that requirement to be there late. And it was never enough. And then every time, the last 3 months of the film, it's always an emergency, always a crisis. We're always behind. So you have to put in longer hours, stay up all night sometimes, That got to me over the years, and I just really wanted to get out of the industry. And I was struggling to get out of the industry from probably after the first year I was in it.
So what managed to draw you back in then and go to Weta in 2004, was it?
It was Lord of the Rings, seeing that. And I had taken a few years off to be with my kids, because that job, as I just mentioned, required so much of my attention that I come home very tired, and it wasn't fair to my family. So I ended up quitting the visual effects business to spend more time with the kids, basically, and my wife. So after the kids grew up, they were 18, 19. I saw Lord of the Rings, and it made me very sentimental. It made me really inspired at the same time of how beautiful it was, especially the first one. And I thought, God, I wish I would have worked on that. So I got back in the industry through a company called The Orphanage. Escape was another one that was in Oakland, but it closed down. I think it was the Warner Brothers visual effects company. They were working on Superman. My first job was at Escape in Oakland, an old naval base, beautiful location to work right by the ocean. But then I went to the Orphanage across the bay at the Presidio, another beautiful place to work, and worked for maybe a year on Hellboy and Sin City. Worked on, doing map paintings. Didn't know what I was doing. I was struggling to know what I was doing, because I was making a transition from the painting to the Photoshop. I met a guy that worked on Lord of the Rings, and I was really blown away, and I loved talking to him about it. And he said, well, why don't you go apply? They're still making the Hobbits, and the company's very viable down there. And so I thought, why don't I do that? So I put in an application. San Francisco is where I was living. New Zealand's the middle of nowhere, probably one of the furthest countries from any other country in the world, really isolated place. So it's quite a move to go there. But I got hired for 7 months to work on King Kong for Weta. And then I stayed 15 years.
And I think of Weta as being this, innovative, technical effects house. And, you talked earlier about how your kind of artistry comes from an instinctive kind of background, I guess. How did you adapt to life at Weta, given that, you're working with these huge technical innovators, yet you're more grounded in the kind of the physical aspects and the aesthetic aspects, I guess, of the field?
I think it was an immediate misfit between myself and the company sort of culture. Because I'd come from, again, this really long history of working kind of independently, and also doing something that was so specialized. And as the technology grew, in my opinion, the capacity grew, and the circle that could be, the circle of influence of the technology broadened to cover almost everything. Whereas before it was very specialized categories. You'd have stop motion animation, you'd have matte painting, you'd have miniatures. These things were like almost departments on their own. And I'm not saying that they don't still have that specialty, because they still do, but the software is kind of bridged what it's kind of grown under the umbrella of the digital sort of way to solve problems, sort of the way to strategize how to get a shot done. And I wasn't really hip to that. I wasn't really that integrated in that new culture. So I was kind of working on the old fashioned methods and trying to kind of bring them to Weta, which was like curious to them because they're so technical, so technically driven company, highly technical. You know, it was all about, basically they denied it, but I concluded that they wanted a red button that they could push to create visual reality without even having to have personnel involved. You know, just like a magic button that you could create. You know, I don't know how you program it, but you solve the problem, and they were working on that idea. You know, so it'd be more efficient, and it could be even more broad, including like eliminating a lot of the interface and the opinions of people. You know, so I came up against that in a way, and I got a high profile job there pretty quick. I was just a matte painting person. And then after 3 months, I got talked to by the producer at Weta, and Peter Jackson wanted to see me. So I ended up going to a meeting with him. And he proposed that I would do art direction for King Kong, like expand my role from being just a matte painter in a department to like, do you want to be in charge of the visual of this film, you know, or at least a big part of the influence of it. And I, being naive and being trained to always like respect the director and always look at the director as kind of like almost like a military general, that, you know, there's a hierarchy structure. I said yes. And that was probably my first mistake to do so, because I was new to the culture of the company. And I'm a newbie. So I'm coming into a culture that nobody knows who I am, really, maybe a few people, like that small percentage of people that know the past visual effects. And it's like, who do you think you are? And I've been given this big job to influence people and to have a say so, and nobody knew who I was. So that was difficult for me, let's put it that way. But being loyal and my word, I had said I would do it, I stuck it out to the end. And I did what I could to influence the look of that film. And I think I did good overall. I think it was, you know, if it was midline, it was positive. But, you know, that was my experience there. But I grew to understand the culture better, and I integrated better later after years of, you know, like, I guess, submission to that idea of technology. Does that make any sense?
It does, yeah. I'm kind of thinking, I can imagine a situation where, you know, you have a CGI VFX artist who's trying to find reality, whereas you're trying to find a feeling or an emotion, or using descriptive words like, you know, maybe ethereal or romantic or something like that, whereas they're just trying to hone in on this kind of perfection. It must have been quite difficult to communicate.
So I got an opportunity to have kind of a respite from this dilemma that I was feeling about the technology side of what I was learning about my brain and the creative other part sphere, you know. The feeling part in your question is triggering me because it's so important. Rick Carter was the production designer, and he took me in a way under his wing, not geographically, because we were working remotely. I think he was in Los Angeles. But we'd have these conference calls, and he was the first person that I had heard in many years talk about the idea of, I don't want to talk about the technical. This is what I want from the shot. This is the feeling I want to give it. This is what I want the audience to evoke in the audience as a reaction. I want them to feel these things. And it kind of, to be frank, blew my mind, because it helped me to reconnect with this whole grand tradition of art direction, not for visual effects or technical, but for this kind of broken thread that I had such respect for in the early days of how do you manipulate in a good way, you know, not in any dangerous way, people's experience, their emotions. How do you manipulate them? Well, you do it through color, you do it through lighting, you do it through narrative. Of course, that's what film and music especially does. But you do it, but the visuals are a big part of it. And he was the first guy in many years that I talked to who reconnected me with all of the importance of that. And I couldn't believe it. I couldn't believe how he approached things. He was so successful. I mean, he's working for Steven Spielberg. So Steven, being, of course, so renowned, he would only have what he could afford the best people. And so he had Rick. And I remember just adoring Rick and listening to him, how he sort of, his machinations of how his thought process worked, and being like I very much admired him. So I got a chance to be pulled into like his world, out of Weta's world in a way, for that process. And I would show my work directly to him rather than show it to the hierarchy within Weta. And I don't know how they allowed that, but it did happen. And I think the results were pretty good. I did probably pretty good work for him because of that reason, maybe a little bit higher level than I was used to being able to produce.
I hate this question, but I'm going to kind of ask it in one way or another. But leading on from what you just said, what's been the most gratifying work that you've done now that you kind of look back? You say you've been retired for a couple of years now. Have you had a chance to kind of, process the word is legacy, I guess, the legacy that you have in the industry, and people are still discovering it now and people are still enjoying it now? Is there one thing or a number of things that you look back on that you think is your, maybe not your best work, but the work that you enjoyed the most, you had the most satisfying creative experience on?
Yeah, I guess it's going to be probably an answer that might be a surprise. It's kind of a surprise to myself, actually, as it's coming up in my mind. And that was maybe working on the first project we worked on for HBO. I think it was Dawn's Early Light. There was some matte paintings we worked on for that. That project was pretty interesting because we were free, completely free. It wouldn't be anybody that would know about it. I actually saw it on like Netflix, or it was offered on YouTube or something recently, and I didn't have the heart to watch it all or anything, but I just saw the preview for it and I thought, oh God, I remember all that. And I think that to me was a great experience, to be able to be free from, it was just Craig and I, and we lived. We had our little location was a garage next to Domino's Pizza, so we could get pizza anytime we wanted to. So if you have pizza that available, and you have to work long hours, and you're working for yourself, as humble as it was, there's something about striking out on your own and having that challenge of producing success, which only comes from a lot of dedication and I suppose resiliency, to not give up, because it's hard. And I think that whole thing was a conglomeration of all those ideas, when I think back on it. Whereas when I worked for other corporate companies, I kind of summarize it as I worked for tycoons in my life. George was a tycoon, Peter Jackson, Steven Spielberg's a tycoon. I worked for these people that had these massive amounts of infrastructure that existed. And I think producing our own little infrastructure and building that was also additionally creatively satisfying. So that's I didn't think I would answer it that way, but yeah, I like that.
Well, I hope you enjoyed my chat with Michael. I certainly did. Amazing, really, that I've known his work and his name all my life. And I'm just really pleased to have been able to talk with him. Thanks, Michael. Coming up on the Filmumentaries podcast, I have composer Daniel Pemberton. Yes, we've nearly managed to arrange a date to conduct the interview. What we have, in fact, is a number of dates, and I'm to call him on each of those dates. And when I get a yes, I need to head up to London to his studio so that we can spend a couple of hours talking about his work as a movie composer. I'm also speaking with costume designer Marlene Stewart in the coming weeks, hopefully. Yet to set a date, but she's keen, now that she's got a little gap in between projects. Plus, Gino Acevedo. He was Senior Prosthetics Supervisor at Weta Workshop and Creature VFX Art Director at Weta Digital. Michael Pangrazio kindly put me in touch with him, and we might be doing something a bit different. We might go for like a video podcast. In fact, while I'm saying this now, maybe we'll do something live. That could be interesting. And I should add thanks to a bunch of people for questions that they had. I wasn't able to ask any of them because they kind of came up naturally in conversation. Some of them, of course, I already had. But thanks to DG Adoy, thanks to Warren York, thanks to Angel de Jorge, thank you to Paul Weller, Captain Nemo, Miles Watts, Will Buxton, Joe Pinney, Giles Terrera, and the Comic Crush. Actually, the Comic Crush, I did ask your question about consulting with the director of photography to get the lighting correct. That was a great question, so yeah, thank you for that one in particular. Yeah, I hope you enjoyed the conversation. Thank you for joining me once again, and I do hope you can join me for the next episode of the Filmumentaries podcast.